Well, I want to welcome everybody joining us tonight for part two of this talk. And again, my wish for everybody is that you stay healthy. And what has changed in the last 2 weeks, a lot of things change in a couple of weeks, is that there's some good news about the vaccines coming in. And so hopefully we'll hear that there'll be a rollout and we'll start to see a light at the end of this epidemic. And I hope that you'll all stay well. And we're coming towards the holiday season, and we're going to be meeting again during Hanukkah. But just everybody stay healthy and listen to the medical experts and what they tell you. So this is part two of this two-part talk. And what I wanted to do was first give you a little piece of good news that I saw on the internet just recently. This did circulate among colleagues. And so I hope that this represents a very positive change from 2020 to 2021. So just for those of you that haven't been observing these talks that I've given, it's a series of several talks on a general theme of how science meets the Bible. And these are the various talks that many of which I have given now. And the first four of these deal with dating the events in Genesis and Exodus. These talks are located, as Cora mentioned, and I first want to thank Cora, who's our program chair here at our Shul Beth David B'nai Israel Beth Am here in Toronto. And she's been invaluable, and she's our illustrious coordinator, and couldn't do all this without you. So thank you again for being part of this. So these talks are on the website. The fifth one, where the Holy Temple stood and where the Ark lay on the Temple Mount, Cora, again, with her brilliance, has slotted this for 2 weeks from tonight. And it's during Hanukkah, which is the ideal time to discuss the archaeology of the Temple Mount, because that's where the temple stood, and the temple is the center focus of the story of Hanukkah, of course. So that'll be something that we'll be presenting exactly 2 weeks, and it'll be during the holiday. And today we are dealing with the hidden messages in biblical Hebrew. Talk number 6 on Kabbalah geometry is one that she'll be slotting in January. We'll give you lots of notice for that. And that's kind of a fun talk that has modern applications. And as she mentioned, I'll just put it on here. So if you do want to go back to look at this talk again or any of the other talks, you go to YouTube, you search our synagogue, and the first item that will come up is a list that says 80 or whatever, 82 sermons or 82 items. And on those items, if you click that, you will see the first row has this, will have this talk within the next few days, as well as the first one of this two-part series. And it'll also have the other 4 talks that I've given if you wanted to go back and see those. Now, the 2 of them are up and near the first or second row of the array, but if you want to see 2 of them, they are further down in the June and July group. But they're all up there now, and you're welcome to look at them in your leisure. The talks all require that you have some familiarity with various aspects of science. So these are the various scientific disciplines that we've had to use in order to understand some of the early stories in the Bible, and which we'll also be applying today, and which was also applied in part 1. In addition to the fact that I have to give you some very basic math and statistics, but I'll be very gentle, so don't worry, we're not going to go too deep into that. And if you don't remember your logarithms and that from high school, don't worry, we will be giving it to you as in what you need. So those of you that were with us 2 weeks ago, just to remind you, these are the topics that we discussed. So we talked about the Hebrew letters and the hexagram. I'll show you that again now, just an interesting thing from the internet. We talked about gematria, about the science of numerology and various examples. We went into the meanings of the first two letters, the aleph and the beit. And by the way, this is such a rich area that you could actually create a full hour talk on each of the Hebrew letters. So we just dealt with aleph and beit very superficially, but there are many, many layers again discussing each of the letters. We're going to do another letter today, which I hope you'll find interesting. We also talked about some interesting words about herayon, which is pregnancy, mayim, the structure and how it relates to the chemical properties, and leiv, about the connection, remember, the end of the Torah and the beginning of the Torah in a circulation. We discussed the calculation of pi, which was a brilliant deduction by the Gaon of Vilna a few centuries ago, who found that there was an extra letter in one of the words in the Nevi'im, and was able to make a calculation that gave you the value of pi to to a number of decimal places. And finally, some hidden relationships showing you the relationships of various items in the Tanach and how their properties actually have a relationship. And we're going to do some of that later on. So here's the themes for today. In part two, I'm just going to show you again the letters of the hexagram. Then we're going to talk about parts of the body, some interesting properties about ozen, ayin, and peh. And then we're going to do some more interesting words part two or version 2. We're going to talk about what's called a SATOR square. And then we're going to talk about emet, kedusha, and Succah. We're going to deal with a couple of interesting names. We have another section, Science Meets the Bible, with hidden relationships. And finally, we're going to finish with the grand finale, will be the small and large letters in the Tanach. And the final component of that is one that may send shivers down your spine. It certainly did for me when I realized what was there. And that's going to be dealing with the enigmatic book, Megillah of Esther. Here are some of my sources, and I just want to give you a specific source, number 1, and that is a professor by the name of Haim Shor, and he wrote a book. I showed this to you last time in part 1. It's called Coincidences in the Bible and in Biblical Hebrew, and you can order this on any of the bookstore websites. And it has extremely detailed analyses that we're just going to deal with superficially today, but some of his material will be in some of the discussions I'll be giving you. Also, a shout out to Rabbi Michael Skobach, who's one of the leaders of Jews for Judaism here in Toronto, who gave a series of lectures last year on the mystical meaning of the Hebrew alphabet, and I'll be quoting some of his work as well. There's also the Zohar. There's Dr. Rosenblatt, who wrote a chapter in a Yeshiva University publication, which I'll be alluding to as well. He was a medical student who wrote this article. We're going to talk about the Midrash Rabbah. We also have the Talmud, the Book of Letters, Mystical Aleph Beit, and of course the Tanakh itself. And I'll make the statement again that I've made at all of my talks, that you really have to know the biblical Hebrew, the Hebrew itself, the letters, how the letters are put together, and how they're related to each other. We're going to go through all kinds of different ways of analyzing these letters. So we're going to start out first, and I like to include little historical anecdotes. All of these photos I'll be showing you at the breaks are all ones that you can get on Wikipedia or through other sources, so they are in public domain. And this is what the construction of Disneyland looked like in 1954. So just to show you again, the Kabbalistic view of creation from day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and finally, all of the components of the creation story. And it presents us a hexagram, which also we call the Star of David. But as I mentioned before, it's not a unique Jewish symbol. It's actually a symbol of various religions and mystical properties. But within this hexagram, if we look at it from a Jewish perspective, all of the letters of the Aleph Beit are contained and can be found within this hexagram. And it was my brother-in-law Stan who actually sent this along to me the first time I saw it. And it just leads us into the discussion of how all these letters are related to each other. So this will be section 1. Those of you that might recognize this is a photo from the first World Series on the first year that Fenway Park was opened in Boston. Shout out to our American viewers tonight. Let's go to parts of the body. That's our first stop on this tour. And just to say again that here are the letters, the Hebrew alphabet, and these letters have, as I say, each of them has a numerical value and also various mystical properties in how they're designed. And you can look at the numerical value of the letters and also their relative positions. And when you look at it, you have these numerical values from Aleph through Yud, are values 1 through 10. The next section from Kaf through Tzadi are in increments of 10. And finally, the last 4 letters are in increments of 100. So if you have to go above 400, as we'll see later, you actually have to combine letters in order to get the sum to what you want. So let's start about the parts of the body. Some of these are very short little items, but the ozen, which is the word for ear, contains physiologically the organ for hearing and also for balance. So the nerve to the ear is a combined nerve for not just hearing, but also for balance. And in the Tanach, there's the word for balance is moznaim. So a balance scale is moznaim, and you can see that the word balance is actually in the word, and that means that when this word was created or first presented, that there was some notion that it wasn't just a word for hearing, but the word balance is actually contains this word. So the awareness that the organ is not just that for hearing, but also for balance is actually inherent in this word. Now in Exodus and Shmot, there's the passage there when they get into Mishpatim, into the various laws, about compensation for various injuries, whether intentional or not. And this is part of the pasuk, ayin tachat ayin, peh tachat peh, and you talk about intentional injury, that there should be compensation. So let's talk about the word ayin, an eye for an eye. Ayin is the Hebrew word for an eye. And this is where I bring my ophthalmology colleagues into this, because the letter ayin is also the name for the letter. So the word ayin, which is the word for eye, is also the name of the letter itself. And if you look at the letter in terms of these components, and this is now something that this medical student, Rabbi Blumenthal, actually figured out, that if you take that letter, ayin, the Zohar, which is the mystical text of the Kabbalah, actually states that in the interior of the eye are found many nerves. The central pillar produces sight, and one branch goes to the top of the head. This is from several centuries ago. And if you actually look at the design, what does it mean that it actually goes into the brain? Well, it's absolutely right. The visual pathway from the eye, this ayin, into the brain goes towards what's called a decussation or a crossing. And from that point, the information from the two eyes goes together on each side into the brain. So behind this crossing, the information going along each of these tracts is actually combined from both eyes. And you can see that the design of this nerve pathway, as intimated by the Zohar, is actually the same shape as the letter itself, which is the letter for the eye. Now, something else that's interesting about this passage is that all the Mefarshim, all the commentators state specifically that when you have an intentional injury of a body part, it's not meant that the punishment be a matching injury to the perpetrator. Instead, the intention was that there'd be monetary compensation for these type of injuries. So what does the text actually say? Well, it says ayin tachat ayin, and tachat means under. Now, if you look at the actual letters ayin yud nun, ayin tachat ayin, and you look at the letters, what are the letters under each of those letters? Under the ayin is a pei. Under the yud is a kaf. Under the nun is the samech. So near to each of those, the letters under each of those, ayin tachat ayin, under the ayin is pei, kaf, samech, and when you put those in order, it's kesef. That's the Hebrew word for money. And that's exactly what the commentators say for ayin tachat ayin. Not only do the commentators mention that it's a monetary compensation intended, but the letters themselves, ayin tachat ayin, actually gives you the same result. What about another part of the body? The word for language is safa. Safa is composed of a sin combined with pei hey. So the language itself is given through the mouth, through a peh. In Genesis 1, chapter 1, the very first verse of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. After that, and I have to give Rabbi Skobach the credit for bringing this to my attention, in the various verses following that, we don't hear that of that Elohim that God created, as it is in the first sentence. It says Vayomer Elohim, and it emphasizes the fact that all of the Maaseh Bereshit was created through oral commands by Hashem. God created the world through these oral commands. So how does that relate to Safa or Peh? Well, if he did it through oral commands, and you look at the first letters of all of those words, those first few words, and you look at their numerical equivalents, it comes out to 22. So after he created the Shamayim, he created the heavens and the earth, from then on, he took those letters, and by oral commands, that's the same as the number of letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and it's through words, through those 22 letters, that we now have the creation going forward. The next section, we're coming first. This is Hans Christian Andersen in 1870. Now we're coming to some interesting words. First, the word emet. There's a lot you can say about the word emet. It means truth, but it has some other interesting properties. Emet is also a concept that is used to express the entirety of the Hebrew alphabet and all that represents, and all of creation as well. Because if you look at the three letters, they are actually the letters at the beginning, the end, and in the middle. And so mystically, it's thought to be a word that encompasses all that we see and all that we believe and all of our thoughts. But it also happens to be the three letters at the end of the first three words. Again, Bereshit bara Elohim, again, implicating its role in the creation of all that is, created through the letters of the Torah, which include the 22 letters of the alphabet spoken through God's words. Emet also, this is from the Tehillim, from the Ketuvim, from the writings, the third part of the Old Testament. There are three books that are considered to be combined philosophy and sayings and words of wisdom. The three books of Job, Proverbs, and Psalms, which in Hebrew are Iyov, Mishlei, and Tehillim, they are called the words of the books called Emet. And so when people describe the truth, the books of truth, they're describing the books of Emet, which are these three. How about the word Kadosh? Kadosh and the word Kedusha are related. And Kedusha and Kadosh refers to holiness, but it also refers to separation and distinctness. And if you look at the four letters of Kedusha, which is a Hey, a Shin, a Dalet, and a Kuf, we know that the people of Israel are meant to be an kadosh, that we have to stay kadosh and in a state of kedusha, and we have to also remain close to Torah. So let's take the kedusha. So in order for us to be holy, to be an kadosh, we have to be next to the Torah. That is our water spring of knowledge. If you take the kuf now, just as we did with the ayin, if you take the kuf and what is the letter next to it? Is the resh. You take the daled. What is next to the daled? It's hey. Take the sheen. Beside the sheen is taf, and beside the hey is Torah. Is the vav, and if you take those four letters, now a vav, taf, hey, and resh, reorganize them, you have the word Torah. So in other words, to be an kadosh, we have to be next to and keep the Torah, and the letters actually fulfill that requirement. This is a little tidbit that I actually learned when I was a student at Chat, our local parochial high school. The meaning of the word Succah, 3 letters, samech, kaf, and hey. If you take these letters and look at the Gemara, the tractate of Succah actually describes the allowed designs of a sukkah for the festival of Sukkot. It turns out that the allowed designs are the exact 3 letters of the word Sukkah itself. And this was taught to me by the late Rav Shoichet, Alav Shalom, in one of our sessions in grade 10. Now I give a shout out to Cora's friend, Cora's partner there, Aaron Kogan. He sent me something after the last talk that I wanted to include this because I thought this was really neat. There is something in puzzle and in, it's called semiotics, which is the analysis of puzzles, something called a SATOR square or a ROTAS square. And these are puzzles that are 5 by 5 arrays where there is perfect symmetry of all the words. So if you look at this first line as SATOR, and this comes from an ancient Roman inscription that was located in France, in a small village in France, dating from Roman times. And if you look at the word SATOR or ROTAS, it's actually perfectly symmetric all the way around this array. And not only that, the other words are also symmetric around it. Opera, 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 opera. So this square has perfect symmetry of the letters in this 5 by 5 array. And now we can go and apply, we can see how this was applied many centuries ago. In Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, in Parshat Akev, it talks about God giving us the land of Israel, a land flowing with milk and honey, Eretz Zavat, Chalav Udvash, a very famous phrase that I'm sure most of you or all of you know of. What about this Dvash? In various Talmudic tractates, in Chulin, Avodah Zarah, and Ketubot, there's discussion around the issue of honeybees, which are actually forbidden species for us to eat, and yet their product, the honey they produce, is allowed. But the discussion among the Rabbanim and the sages is, what if a part of the bee or its leg falls into the honey? Does that make it contaminated so it's no longer kosher, or can we still eat the honey? So what happens? Is it still permitted to eat? Well, we go back to a quote, and it's ascribed to Avraham ibn Ezra, who was one of the great commentators. He's one of the competitors and peers of Rashi. So if you see a book of Torah with the commentaries Rashi, right beside it, you'll see Ibn Ezra, and very often the two did not agree. But Ibn Ezra was actually a very Renaissance man in his time, back in the 11th century or 12th century. And he was an astronomer, an engineer, he was a mathematician, and also a brilliant Bible scholar. And he commented, at least it's ascribed to him, although not for sure whether it was he that was the first to describe it. He gave an answer to this question. Marshanu ra vatan shebidvash nitba'er v'nisraf. we learned that gluten, which is just byproducts in the honey, it was actually burned and incinerated in the preparation of the honey. And according to Ibn Ezra, it would still permit us to have the honey. But if you take this actual phrase, this was quoted, and this is what's in the in the books that quote him, and just change we have to change the sofiyot, the letters that are the nun and the fe, to these letters here. They create a perfect ROTAS square. So the words parshanu, 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 and parshanu are perfectly symmetric around this array. And then the second word, ravato, this glutton that gets in, is also symmetrically arrayed in this square. So it's ascribed to a medieval scholar, could be Ibn Ezra, but I just thought this was really neat, and I thank Aaron for pointing this out. This is a gentleman that all of you will know, but maybe not when he was in his youth. This is Alfred Hitchcock, taken in 1922. Interesting names, next section. In Bamidbar, in Numbers chapter 8, God gives the command to Moses that the Levites, the Leviim, should be selected from within Bnei Israel. So how do we actually take the Leviim from within Bnei Israel? The two words, the key words are mitoch, from within, and Yisrael, of course, the Israelites. Well, now here's another way. I told us another way that you can analyze the words and the letters in the Tanach. Just another variation of various ways that these words are looked at. Let's take the actual names of the letters. So there are actually Hebrew names for each of the letters that are spelled out. We saw the word ayin for the letter ayin, and that's the name of the letter spelled out. And the letters of Yisrael can be spelled out with their words, the yud, a shin, a resh, and a taf. Yud, sin, resh, aleph, and lamed. So these are the 5 Hebrew letters. And if you take those letters, it says from within the Israelites, from within Israel. So what if we take the middle letters from within, betoch, each of those letters, each of those words? So now the actual letters are the vav, the yud, the lamed, and mem within the letters of Yisrael. That creates these 5 letters. And what do they spell? Leviim. So within the letters of Yisrael, bitoch Yisrael, you can actually take the center letters of the names of those letters, and you derive the Leviim bitoch Bnei Yisrael. How about the name Adam? Adam was the first human imbued with man's godly soul, the first one with a soul. And it's 3 letters, Aleph, Daled, Mem. And if we look at it from 2 sections, the Aleph and the Daled and Mem, and separate them out, we know from the first talk last 2 weeks ago that Aleph has very specific properties, and it's ascribed to Hashem for various reasons, which we went into detail in the last talk. But the Dam also has some interesting properties. So Aleph is the spiritual side. The Aleph associated with Hashem is what's imbued with our soul from the spiritual side. Dam, which means blood, represents our physical side. So the name Adam is a combination of a spiritual and a physical entity. And of course, if you lose your soul, it's as if you're spiritually dead. And that's why when we talk about in the Amidah, but Mechayeh Metim, there are some midrashim that actually talk about Metim as not being physically dead, but spiritually dead. And so the spiritual side is what imbues us with the special qualities. And if you looked at the characteristics of the Aleph, the same as we showed 2 weeks ago, many of the Hebrew letters are actually composed of pieces or parts of other letters. And the Aleph is considered to be composed of 3 pieces. And the letters are a pair of yuds, and then the stem is a vav. So the aleph is actually a combination of these three letters, and the three parts of the aleph, when you add them up, comes to 26. I showed you this 2 weeks ago. 26 is the same as the sum of the letters values of the Yud He Vav He, the sacred name of Hashem, which is called the Tetragrammaton. And so the aleph, among many properties, is one that's associated with Hashem as a singularity. So if you take Adam, man's godly soul, and separate it into the two sections again, the aleph has a value of 1, and Adam total is 45, composed of the 44 of Dam and the 1 of the aleph. So here's the aleph, the Daled and Mem, summing to 44. And if you look at that 1, it's the physical side created by a mother and a father. So the aleph is produced and given to us by Hashem, the single one, and the 44 is given to us by an Av and Aim, which is 41 plus 3 is 44. The numerical equivalent responsible for creating the physical side, the same as the value of the letters Av plus Aim. This is Mahatma Gandhi dancing in 1946. Now we're going to go into another few examples of how science meets the Bible. And I put this question mark, are they hidden relationships? And I'll let you again, like after the last talk, decide if these are coincidences or there's a hidden, very deeper purpose in the way that these letters and words are designed. So I give you again the reference to Haim, who's a professor of engineering at, I think it's actually Ben Gurion University of the Negev. And he must have had a lot of time on his hands because he did a lot of the analysis of various things that I've been showing you. And we're going to do 4 different items today. We're going to talk about various metals, chemicals, the speed of sound and light, and planetary masses. And for Charlie, we will be adding Earth into this for you for today, okay? So 2 statistical facts to know. I'm just going to give you, again, a brief outline of some of the things you have to know just to understand what these plots are going to be. And what I mentioned 2 weeks ago was that you can actually look at the relationship of variables either in a linear or logarithmic scale. So when you're plotting along one axis, if it's purely numerical on the other axis, we call that a linear plot, and we plot the best fit line to represent the relationship between the variables at the x-axis and the variables on the y-axis. So this is what's called a linear plot. But if you remember back to your high school math, we did some logarithms, and some relationships are actually based on a logarithmic scale rather than a linear scale. And what that means, it's either to a certain base or to a natural logarithm. We're not going to have to worry about natural logarithms tonight. But there's 2 statistical facts. The first is about the relationship can be logarithmic. And it means that the values on the y-axis are not consecutive 1, 2, 3, 4, but are multiples of each other, such that when you actually take the logarithm, they become linear, but they are actually based on an exponential or kind of multiplicative factor. So if I don't want to lose you with this, but just to know how these numbers are derived. The second item is about what's called regression analysis, because what you have to do once you get this relationship, you want to know how strong is the relationship between one item and the other item. So the x values and the y values, how good is the relationship that you've designed by this line. And this is called a regression analysis. For those of you with statistical know-how, it's called an R-squared. And it gives you what's called a correlation scale. And a correlation scale is a scale of relationship from very, very poor or non-existent to very, very strong. And the scale goes from 0 to 1, and anything between 0.6 and 0.8 is considered very, very good. If you get anything higher than that, it's considered extremely strong. And it's very rare in science to have correlations over 0.9. That is unbelievably high. But as you saw in part 1, there are relationships among various scientific items and their numerical values that are extremely, extremely strong. And the same is going to be today. And finally, in terms of whether it's logarithmic or linear, if it's a positive upgoing line, it's called positive correlation, but you can also have what are called negative correlations where the actual line relationship goes down. So the higher one value, the lower the other. This is called a negative correlation. But the important thing is, how strong is this relationship designated by this line relationship? And what I'm going to show you along one axis are the numerical values, and on the other are the units or measures. If it's a negative correlation, again, the numerical values will be along the bottom, and the units or measures will be on the left in the y-axis. So now let's apply this, talking about various metals. In the Tanach are listed a number of metals. These are ones that are actually listed. These are the Hebrew words, the transliteration, and it's pladot, nechusha, kesef, bdil, and zahav. And what's the measures that we're going to use? Well, if you remember your high school chemistry, that these various compounds have atomic weights. But in order to standardize the comparison among different elements, chemists also use what's called the reciprocal atomic weight, which you use in calculations with Avogadro's number and molar equivalents. So we're actually going to be using the reciprocal atomic weight, and I've listed those values on the right. And now if you plot them, the numerical values of these substances against their reciprocal atomic weight, it's a linear plot. We don't have to use a logarithm for this. There is gold, numerical value of tin and its reciprocal atomic weight, the same for silver, copper, and iron. Just like the things we saw, the items we saw back 2 weeks ago, an astounding correlation between the two. Is it a coincidence? I'll leave that to you. Other chemical substances that are listed in the Tanach: limestone, quicklime, silica, and sodium. These are the Hebrew words. And these are the measures. Again, we're going to use the reciprocal atomic weight. So for all of these different substances, we have their numerical values, their reciprocal atomic weights, and now we're going to plot them again. This will be a linear scale. There are the numerical values of these substances, the reciprocal atomic weights. In a linear plot, there's limestone, quicklime, silica, and sodium. What's the correlation between these substances and their numerical equivalents and their reciprocal atomic weights? Astoundingly highly correlated. How about speeds of sound and light? This is a very short one, and I have to give Haim a little bit of credit. He was doing a little out-of-the-box thinking to get this one. There is silence and stillness, there is sound, and there is light. Silence is dmama, kol is sound, and or is light. Now, you can't have 0 for the silence, so he had to put in artificially a speed of 1. So we're going to look here at their speed, the speed of these different items. There's a speed of sound and a speed of light, and they're known physically, at least on Earth. And we take the log of the speed. So now we're going to look at a logarithmic plot. So we have the numerical values of these 3 items, the log of the speed. But the key is, in this logarithmic plot, you have them in a perfect relationship with an R value, again, very, very high. Finally, planetary masses. Now, if you remember 2 weeks ago, we did planetary diameters, extremely highly correlated between their log of diameter against their numerical equivalent. What about the masses of the planets? Totally different physical property. These are the names of the planets and their Hebrew names: Kima, Mazar, Ksil, Shachar, Teman, Esh, and Ash. So they are different. Ash and Esh are different. We're going to look now at the log, another logarithmic plot of their mass. The numerical values I've listed here for you, and the log of their mass on the right. In kilograms, here are the numerical values, the log of their mass. And this logarithmic plot: Mercury, Mars, Venus, Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, and Jupiter. What's the correlation? 0.979 between their numerical values and the log of their mass. Extremely, extremely high correlation. Again, this would be, in scientific circles, this would be an extremely high regression, very high correlation. So is it coincidence? Again, I'll leave that to you. But there is what we call Earth. What about Earth? Earth, the word is Eretz. Aleph Resh Tzadi. It has a mass, and that is the logarithm to the base 10 of its mass. And Eretz, taking the 3 letters, has a numerical value for Earth of 291. Does Earth follow this relationship? Well, to please those of you that wanted to see it from last time, here's Earth. There is its numerical equivalent, 291, right there. What is its mass? The log of its mass is 57.05. Where does Earth fall on this graph? Right on the line. So even Earth follows this regression line. Coincidence or not? Final section. Any idea who this man is? His actual name is pronounced Vincent van Gogh, not Go or Goch, van Gogh. That's the Dutch name. He's a painter, if you want to know. The final section, and I saved this to the end for a couple of reasons. We're going to talk now about small and large letters in the Tanakh. So not only have we talked about the position of letters relative to other letters, looking at the names of the letters with section taking the middle of letters and doing something with it, looking at how the letters are shaped and what their implication might be and their meaning. Now we're going to look at the size of the letters themselves. Just another interesting variation. And unless you've looked at a Tanakh, unless you've looked at a what we call the actual script within the Torah, or a tikkun, which is the book from which we study how to read the Torah and the Megillot, the text actually has the very formal fancy letters and the crowns, but some letters are on different sizes. And in one place in the Torah, there's actually a broken letter, which we can just mention soon. So among the larger letters, there are 31 throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Tanakh, from Genesis 1:1, as I'll show you, right through till Divrei Hayamim or Chronicles 1. There are smaller letters, that are 28 of those, that come from Genesis chapter 2 right through until the book of Daniel in the Ketuvim. And one place where a letter is purposely broken into 2 parts in chapter 25 of Bamidbar in verse 12. And it has to do with Pinchas, who was the high priest, the ben of Elazar the Kohen. You'll notice that Pinchas is written with a yud that is small in the text. It's actually in the text. And if you look at a tikkun or a Torah itself, you'll see that the yud is small. And the verse that follows that, et briti shalom. This is the broken letter. It's a vav in the word shalom that is incomplete. And the reason that the Mefarshim, the commentators, mention that is because Pinchas, in his fervent support of God, actually had to kill two perpetrators who were desecrating the name of God in their actions. And he was praised for being so fervent for God, but criticized by God for taking two lives in order to make his point. So the Mefarshim give the reason that Pinchas cannot be a complete person. And these two items are a reduction. It's Hashem's way of showing that he is a flawed character. And that act, even in the fervent support of Hashem and his principles, does reduce his character slightly in the eyes of Hashem. So the Yud is there to diminish his stature, and the Shalom is there to indicate that it is not a complete piece. It's actually a flawed or broken piece. The one time in the Torah with a broken letter. Now, what about the large and small letters? Well, in Devarim, chapter 6, verse 4 is one of the most famous phrases, the one that we repeat several times a day, the Shema Yisrael. This is the Shema Yisrael in the regular writing, but if you look again in the Tanach, and you also see in many of our prayer books, that's not exactly how it's written. Two of the letters are actually enlarged. And there's various reasons why. I'll give you two. One is that the Ayin and Daled put together create the word aid, which is witness. So the pshat, so the easy sort of explanation, is that we are meant to be witnesses as God's emissaries on earth, and is our job to be witnesses for Hashem's existence and supremacy in the world, and to take that message to the world. But there is another meaning, and that is to make sure that we do not use the wrong letter. And if you're not careful and you're not paying attention, you could make an incorrect letter in when you're writing out these words. Ayin is a silent letter, so is Aleph. You don't want to mix the two up. And the Daled, scripturally, is very similar to a Resh, and you don't want to make that mistake either. And so one of the reasons is that Shema, which is the word maybe, you don't want the implication that it may be that Hashem is our God. You also don't want the implication possibly of making an error and saying that his God is another God, that we have Eloheinu, but it's a different God. You don't want that word to creep in. And this is to reduce the chance that the two words could be misread, that maybe Hashem is, or another is God. We don't want that to happen. And so these letters are made larger to clear the point that they have to be exactly right. Another spot where there is a letter that is changed are minification letters that are smaller. The very first word of the book of Leviticus, of Vayikra, has a small aleph in the script. And there's some interesting midrashim as to why that is the case. The aleph is made small, and it relates to the meaning of two words that are both present and can be actually, it's a play on a word. There's a word vayikar, which goes without the aleph, and vayikra, which contains a full aleph. They are different words. One of the words, vayikar, appears in the story of Balaam. Balaam was the person sent on his ass, if you remember, that was supposed to curse the Israelites, but instead praise them. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, that's the praise. He didn't follow King Balak's directions, but during his wanderings towards the Israelites, he chanced upon Hashem, and the word there is vayikar. But the first word of Leviticus is read vayikra, not vayikar, vayikra. It actually implies that there's an aleph there. What the Mefarshim say is that the first word vayikar we use for a chance occurrence. The second vayikra is a deliberate, purposeful calling. So we have both possibilities here. The first is a chance occurrence, the second is purposeful. And from the Midrashim, Moses was a humble man, anav mikol adam. He wanted to write the first word without an Aleph because he wanted to say that this was a chance meeting with Hashem. But Hashem would have none of that. He said, no, I'm coming to you deliberately. And they had an argument. And they settled with this. So Moses claimed that it was a chance. Hashem said it was deliberate. They compromised by putting in the Aleph, but diminishing its size. And now we come to the grand finale. I have a few things to say about the book of Esther. And some of what I'm going to discuss, I have not presented before. Some I'm going to allude to and comes from a different talk, as I'll mention in a moment. There are problems, many problems with the book of Esther. And many of you are aware of these different enigmas. First of all, in the part of the Megillah that we have, what do I mean by the part of the Megillah? Well, we have the Megillat Esther from chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 3. In those 10 or 9 and a little bit chapters, the name of Hashem is not mentioned. Or is it? Or is it? There's also the hidden forces at work. What is going on behind the scenes? We believe, as Jews and commentators, biblical commentators for centuries have said that the events could not have happened without a guiding force, because there's too many chances that occur for all of those events to occur as they were described. And when is the turning point of the plot? We have to discuss that in a moment. And what is the connection between the Purim to Passover interval? That's that 1 month, that 4 weeks between Purim and Pesach and Maaseh Bereshit. Now, this is a chidush. And I'll tell you that if you want to find out how I related these two, it's in no sources that I know of and that many Rabbanim have ever known about. So I've checked with many sources, and this is something that has never been described before. I'm not going to do it tonight, but if you want to see how these two are related, how Purim and Pesach and the Megillah is related to Purim and Passover and Maaseh Bereshit, I'll refer you to the talk on creation story, which is in the compendium and array on the Beth David website on YouTube. So you can go to see that talk where we discuss the different aspects of the creation story, and I go into detail about that connection. So I don't want to do that tonight because I did that in that talk. So we're going to deal with the other 3 items. I said, is the name of God really mentioned? Well, as I mentioned, there's no explicit name of Hashem in the text. In the canon, which means the part that is included in the Tanach as we have it now. There are many books that existed in the time that the Tanach was put together, called the Apocrypha. And there's many books, such as the book of Maccabees, which are the books on which the story of Hanukkah is based. It's not in the Tanakh. There's books of Enosh. There's books of Hanoch, the book of Hanoch or Enoch, which is in the Septuagint. These books, these extra books are in the Septuagint, which was the translation of the Tanakh into Greek during the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE. So those books do exist, and we have a larger book of Esther in that in that compendium of the Septuagint, but some of the books were not included, and there are actually other chapters of Esther, not in the Tanakh, but in the Apocrypha. Chapter 10, verse 4, the first verse following what we have in the Megillah, has Mordechai said, God hath done these things. So the name of Hashem does appear in the Septuagint and in the Apocrypha that includes the last 5 chapters of the book of Esther. So yes, it's not in the canon as we have it, but the Apocrypha does contain the name of Hashem. Why it was eliminated, there's many theories as to why those extra chapters were eliminated and why we are left with the text without the name of Hashem. But you have to assume that Hashem is behind what's going on. And I gave several pieces of evidence in my talk on the creation story, but there are several aspects to this. One is that the plot is so complex that you can't really reason that there wasn't a hidden force, which we believe was Hashem guiding the plot. How is it that the lottery, which is described in chapter 3 by Haman, ends up of all the days of the year on Adar 13? So I go into that in more detail in the talk on the Maseh Bereshit. But I want to talk to you about the turn of the plot. When does the plot change to the benefit of the Jews? In other words, the first few chapters, things are not going well at all. Suddenly, the plot changes and things turn 180 degrees, and the whole plot now works in our favor to repeal Haman's evil decree. When does that occur? It occurs in Perek Hay, chapter 5, verse 4. It says, Esther invites the king and Haman to a feast where she will reveal her identity and plead with Achashverosh to repeal his evil decree. And in that verse, you have the words, Yavo HaMelech v'Haman Hayom El HaMishteh. The king and Haman will come today. Look at the first letter of those 4 words. Yavo HaMelech v'Haman Hayom. The Yud Hey Vav Hey. Name of Hashem is not explicit in the text, but the hidden meaning of that passage includes the 4 letters that you see in that. So it's hidden, but it's there. And now we come to my final section here. The paradox of the Bnei Haman. And I'll be interested to know if any of you are aware of what I'm going to discuss with you now. In Esther chapter 9, near the end of the book, it describes the execution of the 10 sons of Haman. Earlier on in the story, we know that when things start to work in the favor of the Yehudim, when things start to become positive and the events start to become in our favor, there is the passage there where Haman was told by the king, remember Achashverosh, who would you put in robes and lead as a hero through the city? Haman thought he would be the one to be riding on the horse, but of course the plot went 180 degrees, and who is on the horse? It's Mordechai, who saved the life of the king by revealing the fact that there was a plot against his life. And Haman, to his disgrace, had to dress Mordechai in the robes and lead him on the horse, which Mordechai rode through the streets of Shushan. In the Midrash Rabbah, so in the Midrash on Esther, there's actually a tale that the daughter of Haman, he had 11 children, 1 daughter and 10 sons. It relates that she thought that her father would be the one on the horse. So she threw garbage out from her window, and instead of it striking Mordechai, who was the one to lead the horse, it struck her father. And when she realized that it was her father who was being disgraced and that Mordechai was being extolled here, she committed suicide. She could not accept the fact that she made this mistake and that her father, the vice-regal of the country, was being disgraced, and she couldn't accept that. And it's told in the Midrash Esther that she committed suicide by jumping to her death. Later on, chapter 9 describes the execution of the 10 sons of Haman. And then 3 or 4 sentences later, in chapter 9, verse 13, a very enigmatic phrase comes up. Because it says, Esther asks the king permission to hang the 10 sons of Haman on the gallows tomorrow. The word is machar. Now, if they've already executed the 10 by hanging, what is she doing asking to hang these 10 sons on gallows tomorrow? The event has already occurred. Vatomer Esther, yitain gam machar la Yehudim. How do we resolve this? How can they be hung to die if they're already dead by hanging? There's two answers. There's a simple answer. The pshat is that Esther wanted their corpses to be hung to show the non-Jews that his evil decree to annihilate the Jews was no longer in effect, that his family was executed, and that the decree was no longer in effect. That's one explanation by the Mefarshi. But there's also another. The Midrash Tanchuma actually states that the Machar and the Melech was not a Chashverosh, but Hashem. And that Machar does not mean the next day, because there was nothing to do the next day. They already were the Jews were going to celebrate. That wasn't what was meant, but what he meant was the word future. So she's pleading with Hashem on behalf of her people for something that didn't already occur, but something that would come in the future. What could that be? So if this refers to something similar, a similar episode to the hanging of 10 men in the future, when will this request or prophecy be fulfilled? And now we have to go back to our letters. And I said again, like in the first talk, we talked about the letters used to create the eponym or the acronym for the Hebrew year. The year we're in is 5781. And as I mentioned in the first talk, what's the Hebrew equivalent? It's 5,000 plus 700 plus 80 plus 1. Again, if you have over 400, you have to combine letters. So we have to use the Tuf and Sheen. 80 is direct to pay. And the 1, of course, is the Aleph. But of course, we have the number 5,000 to account for. There's no 5,000 in this table. And the way you get around it is by using the Hey, which is 5, with a little apostrophe. So that's actually the correct way of writing the Hebrew year. It's not Tuf Shin Pei Aleph, it's Hey Tuf Shin Pei Aleph, but we leave out the Hey for simplicity. But other sages, there's another way that a year can be designated, but not using a Hey, but rather the Vav, because we are in the 6th millennium. And that has very mystical properties, by the way. That's 6,000 years of Jewish history. There's a lot of mysticism with that, which we won't go into today. But the Vav is significant because it's the 6th millennium. We're actually going to use the Vav in the analysis that I'm going to give you now. So let's go back to the 10 sons of Haman. And again, looking at the letters, the hidden meanings of the letters, here are the 10 sons of Haman. And you know that in tradition, when the reader of the Megillah does the 10 sons of Haman, it's done in one breath. You take a breath in and you do all 10 sons in one go. Those of you that were with us for Purim this year, Rabbi Walker did it in a superb way, right through. She did it with no problem at all. But there are all these complicated, Aramaic names. And these are the 10 sons of Haman as they are in the Megillah, but not exactly. They're not exactly the way they appear in the Megillah. Again, you have to look at the exact letters, the exact words to understand. If you look at these 3 names among those 10, there's some very unusual properties. There are the actual ways they're written in this scroll. There are small and large letters among those names. 3 have altered letter sizes. 3 are small, a Tuf, a Shin, and a Zayin. One of them is enlarged. You see the Vav. What cryptic message is hidden among these names? The 10 sons of Haman, the pleading of Esther in the future, that God should make retribution on behalf of his people. Let's take those letters. They add to 707. The Vav is the 6th millennium. This is a year. It points to the Hebrew year, Vav Tuf Shin Zayin, 5707. It corresponds to last century, the fall of 1946 to the summer of 1947. What occurred in the fall of 1946? What event occurred? The reverberations of that prophecy of Esther. 10 men and one committed suicide, one child committed suicide. That story of the Bnei Haman and Haman's daughter from the Midrash. That prophecy, Machar, pleading to Hashem, reverberated over 24 centuries and culminated in events that are within some of your lifetimes. What occurred in the fall of 1946? Culmination of a prophecy from the book of Esther. In the Nuremberg trials, 11 Nazi criminals were scheduled to be executed. Hermann Göring committed suicide 2 hours prior. 11 people condemned to be hanged, one committed suicide. Does that sound familiar? The pleadings of Esther, 10 criminals hung in the year Bav Tuf Shin Zayin, from the hidden message within the book of Esther. So here's how we started. All the Hebrew letters are within the hexagram. So these were the talk. This is the first part. For those of you that are coming in late, you can get this on the website. And today we went through some different aspects, how these letters, words, size of letters, and meanings all are special. And so we did parts of the body. We did various interesting words, including Aaron's suggestion with the SATOR square, the names, science meets the Bible, and those relationships with unbelievable correlations, and the small and large letters in the Tanach, culminating with the most striking one from the meaning of the small letters and large letters within the sons of Haman. And so today, these are the various sciences that we utilized. And throughout the various 8 talks that some of which I've already given now, and the last 2 to give, we'll be covering all of these at some point in these various talks. And that brings us to the end. So I hope you found these enlightening, thought-provoking, provocative, interesting, and whether these are coincidences or not, I leave you to think about them and decide for yourself.